He came to buy a horse. He left with something far worse, a choice that would haunt him through blood and ash. The sky stretched out above him, pale and endless, with a thin veil of cloud dragging slow across the sun. There was something in the way. The light fell faded gold over brittle grass and splintered fence posts that called to the ache behind his ribs. It was the kind of land where men went to disappear. And for a time. He thought that was what he wanted. But the heart has ways of remembering what the mind tries to bury. Each hoofbeat seemed to echo louder than it should, like the land itself was reminding him of another time, another trail, another door he'd once opened to find only silence on the other side, a child's cradle, untouched, a woman's scarf still hanging by the window. He could still feel the weight of dirt beneath his fingers, could still hear the scrape of the shovel biting into frozen ground. He shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking, and exhaled slow. This wasn't about memory, not today. Today he came for a horse. Nothing more. The sun tipped west as he crested the low ridge, and there it was, the battered slats of an old barn, half-leaning, paint long since stripped by wind and time. Beyond it, the land fell away to rust-colored scrub and distant mesas. A narrow trail of smoke twisted up from behind the roofline, thin and weak like it might vanish with the next gust. Silas brought the mare to a slow stop and dismounted without hurry. His knees creaked worse than the saddle. The wind stirred the tail of his coat. He adjusted the battered hat low against the light and took one steadying breath before knocking once on the warped barn door. It swung open without a sound. A man stepped out broad but hunched, face sunburnt to raw leather, shirt half-buttoned and stained. His eyes were small, dark, and mean. "You're late," the man grunted. His voice was dry as gravel. "I'm not here for talk," Silas said flatly. "You got the horse." The man jerked a thumb toward the far pen. Stubborn as hell. Strong, though. Without another word. Silas moved forward. The barn smelled of old hay, dust, and something sharper beneath. The horse was roped tight, eyes rolling white, hooves kicking at dry dirt. It wasn't fear of him, Silas saw that at once. The animal's panic ran deeper, wilder. Then he heard it. A faint sound, a soft thud, the scuff of something or someone trying not to be heard. He stopped cold. The wind rattled the barn slats. The horse stamped. But the sound came again, too soft for a rat, too wet for wind. "What's back there?" Silas asked quietly, without turning. The man shifted too fast. "Storage," he said sharp. "You came for a horse, not a tour." But Silas was already moving, boots echoing on old boards. The man's hand clamped on his arm. In one breath, Silas shoved him back hard enough to send the man stumbling. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't need to. His eyes caught the edge of something half-hidden crates stacked beneath a sagging tarp. A ladder. A darkness that wasn't just shadow. The smell hit him then, sharp with ammonia. Sickness. Rot. The cage was small, rusted, barely more than iron bars lashed with rope. And inside, 2 children. One crouched low, thin arms, locked around a smaller figure whose face was buried against tattered cloth. The older child couldn't have been more than 8 sunken cheeks. Split lip, eyes bright with defiance. Silas froze. The breath he took scraped raw. "Please," the boy whispered. His voice trembled. "Don't let him shut the door again." Behind him, the man spat. "Ain't your concern. Ain't yours. Belonged to some woman owed too much coin. She's dead now. Just leftovers." Silas turned. His voice dropped low. "You selling them?" The man raised his chin. "Ain't illegal. Not if no one asks." Silas felt the heat bloom, not anger. Something deeper, colder. He looked back at the children. The boy didn't beg. His eyes dared him to be the next man who left. Silas reached for his coat pocket. His fingers found the worn leather of his old wallet, the same one that had once held pictures he no longer carried. "What's the price?" he asked. The man blinked. "For the horse?" "No," Silas said softly. "For them." A laugh, dry, harsh. "What the hell you want with near-feral brats?" Silas didn't answer. He dropped gold coins into the dust, one by one. The clink of them cut the air sharp. The man's eyes tracked each fall, counted. "Fine," the man spat. "Take 'em. More trouble than they're worth." He tossed a key, careless, like it meant nothing. Silas caught it mid-air. His hands shook. He knelt by the cage. The key jammed in rust. The lock gave with a scream of iron. The girl flinched so hard she nearly struck the bars. The boy pulled her closer. "Don't touch her," the boy warned. "She's mine." "I'm not here to hurt her," Silas murmured. "Or you." The boy's jaw trembled. "Then why'd you buy us?" Silas searched for the answer but found only silence. The girl looked up. Green eyes, pale as spring grass after storm. Her voice was barely a breath. "Are you taking us away?" "Yes," he whispered, "I am." The boy stood slow, legs shaking. "Then hurry," he rasped, "before he changes his mind." They left the cage behind, but not the fear. Silas lifted the girl so light he barely felt her and set her on the wagon. The boy followed. Barefoot, steps sharp and uncertain, like he half expected the ground to vanish. The man didn't follow. Good. Silas didn't trust himself not to kill him if he did. They rode without words. The sky burned copper, then ash. The only sounds the creak of wheels, the rattle of harness, the girl's soft cough. "What are your names?" Silas asked at last. The boy hesitated. "Eli," he said. "And that's Maggie." Silas gave a single nod. Silas Mercer. He didn't offer more. Couldn't. Every time the words rose about the wife buried last winter, about the baby who never breathed, they caught like glass in his throat. By sundown, they reached the ridge. The land beyond rolled into dusk-colored hills, the edge of the wild. Silas had a cabin west, but not yet. Not for strangers. Instead, he turned toward an abandoned smokehouse near the creek, half collapsed but dry. He lifted Maggie, careful not to wake her as he carried her inside. Eli trailed behind. "We can sleep in the barn," the boy offered. "We don't need." "It's not the barn," Silas murmured. "It's shelter." He lit an oil lamp. Shadows stretched along the cracked walls. Dust settled in quiet layers. Maggie stirred, murmured something soft. Silas's chest tightened. She couldn't have been more than 5. He handed Eli a tin cup of water. The boy drank slow, eyes never leaving him. "You gonna sell us again?" Eli asked. Quiet. Silas froze, then, softly, "No." "Everyone does." Silas sat beside him. "I'm not everyone." The words hung there. Eli's gaze flickered then down. "You smell like someone who lost something too," the boy whispered. Silas didn't answer. Just added another log to the fire and let it burn. Night fell cold. Maggie cried out once, small fingers twitching in restless sleep. Silas woke and covered her shoulders. Gentle. By dawn. Frost rimmed the windows. Eli hadn't slept. Silas found him watching the door, hands tight around an old stick he'd sharpened into a crude knife. "We head for town today," Silas said. Soft. "Need supplies." Eli's eyes narrowed. She's not going anywhere without me. Then bring her. The boy blinked, nodded. They loaded the wagon beneath gray skies. The wind carried a sharp edge, one that smelled of rain and far-off smoke. As they rode, Silas felt it stir the slow, silent weight of something waking inside him, something that remembered what it meant to keep a promise, what it meant to protect. But the road ahead was long, and the past, he knew, didn't stay buried for long. "They're going to come for us," Eli had whispered once. And Silas knew he was right. They would. They always did. They always would. Smoke curled from the chimney of Silas Mercer's homestead for the first time in months, carrying with it the fragile scent of life rekindled. The light that touched the fields was thin and cold, brushing against the brittle grass like fingertips over an old scar. The morning stretched quiet, except for the slow creak of a weather-worn rocker on the porch and the restless twitch of the mare's tail by the barn. In the distance, beyond the line of blackened trees, the sky still held the pale silver of dawn not yet warmed. Silas stood near the woodpile, splitting kindling by hand. Each stroke of the axe felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. He worked without thought, but not without memory. Every sharp crack of wood sent ripples through the stillness, and with every breath, the ache of absence pulled at his bones. The cabin he'd built with his wife still bore the signs of her hands. The embroidered cloth that hung above the stove, the carved spoon left on the shelf, the cradle in the corner empty, untouched. He'd thought once that silence could protect him from that kind of pain. He was wrong. Inside, the two children, Eli and Maggie Banner, moved cautiously through the morning as if expecting the roof to collapse without warning. Maggie, fragile as blown glass, sat near the hearth, her small fingers tracing patterns in the soot as Eli, older and sharper, kept to the shadows. The boy's eyes never rested. He watched the door, the windows, Silas himself. By the time the kettle began to hum, a soft whistle curling up from the cast iron, the scent of weak coffee filled the single-room cabin. Silas poured 2 tin cups, setting them down without a word. Eli stared at the steam before reaching for one, his thin hands trembling despite the still air. "You need food," Silas said at last. His voice was low, but not unkind. "We don't need charity," Eli muttered, but he took the cup anyway. Maggie coughed a dry, rattling sound that twisted something sharp in Silas's chest. He glanced toward the girl, then toward the cradle. He swallowed hard. The day's quiet was broken when the sound of hooves drifted up from the creek, slow, deliberate. Silas's fingers tensed on the axe handle. He set it down smooth, lifted the Henry rifle from the wall, and stepped onto the porch without haste. A single rider approached along the muddy track, a man dressed in worn brown, dust clinging to every fold of his coat. The star on his breast caught the pale light Deputy Marshal Thorne, a man Silas had seen only in passing over the years, mostly in the shadows of saloon doorways or the back pews of the half-abandoned church. Thorne pulled up his mare, nodding once. Silas Mercer. He greeted. His voice was flat as river stones. "Heard you been seen in town yesterday. Heard you weren't alone." Silas said nothing for a long breath. The children remained inside. He didn't need to look to know Eli was watching from behind the curtain. "Brought 2 young ones back," Silas said finally. "Didn't have much of a choice." Thorne adjusted his reins. "There's talk. Men asking questions. About missing property. About things that belong elsewhere." "They don't belong to anyone," Silas murmured. The words left his mouth before he'd fully chosen them. Not anymore. Thorne's eyes narrowed slightly. He was a careful man, worn down by years of dirt justice and the slow erosion of the law in a place too far gone for statutes to matter. You aiming to keep him? Silas's hand brushed against the barrel of the rifle. Not a threat, just instinct. I'm aiming to keep him safe, he said. The wind shifted, carried the distant smell of pine smoke and something sour beneath it, old blood. Maybe. Or wet ash. Thorne sighed. Words out. The men who had 'em. They'll come for what they think's theirs. Silas nodded once. Let 'em. When Thorne rode off, the sound of hoofbeats faded into the hush of open land. Silas stood unmoving for a long moment, his breath fogging the cold air, before he returned inside. The children hadn't moved much. Eli's face was set hard, brittle with distrust. Maggie pressed close to her brother's side, the thin fabric of her dress no match for the chill. We need to get supplies, Silas said quietly. He didn't look at them when he spoke. Town's not far. We can ride. Eli's chin lifted. We ain't going nowhere without each other. Didn't plan to split you, Silas said. His voice was soft, but steel ran through it. Later. They set out under a sky gone to iron. The rutted road cut through fields, stripped bare by winter. Mud clung to the wheels. The wagon creaked, heavy with the weight of things unsaid. Silas drove without hurry, his eyes on the trail ahead, but his thoughts elsewhere. Every twist of the road felt like a memory. Every rock and rise, something he half recognized from years gone. The town of Dustmere Crossing was a place that had long since stopped pretending to thrive. The main street was half mud, half frozen ruts, shuttered windows, crooked chimneys. The general store's paint peeled in ribbons from its wooden walls, and the bell above the door gave a rusty jangle as they entered. The clerk inside, an older man with a face like dried parchment, raised one brow at the sight of the children. That your kin? He asked, measuring each word. Put it on my tab, Silas replied. His tone left no room for questions. Eli trailed close, his hand wrapped tight around Maggie's. The girl said nothing, her eyes too wide, too dark. The clerk made no further remark, just filled the order jerky, flour, matches, a new length of rope. They were stepping out when the shout rang sharp across the street. Hey. Silas turned. Slow. The saloon's porch bore a single figure, tall, clean coat, badge catching light like a fishhook. Another lawman, or close enough to pass for one. Those children with you? The man asked, voice too smooth. Silas felt Eli stiffen at his side. They are, Silas answered. The man nodded toward Maggie, who shrank behind her brother. Funny thing, the man drawled. Heard about a pair went missing down south. Rancher says they're his. Might be I need to ask a few questions. Silas stepped forward, his shadow falling long. They're not his, he said. I paid for 'em. The man's eyes flickered. Paid. Like stock. Paid like human beings that needed saving. The wind stirred dust between them. The sheriff's mouth twitched somewhere between curiosity and contempt. You got proof, he asked. Silas didn't answer. It might have ended badly then, but fate, as it often does, intervened with violence. From behind the saloon, a woman's scream cut through the air, high, wild, ragged, heads turned. The lawman's stance broke. Silas didn't wait. He shoved Maggie into Eli's arms. Stay with her, he told the boy. Don't move. He ran. The saloon's shadow swallowed him whole. Smoke clung to every wall, somewhere beyond the overturned tables and shattered glass. The sound of struggle rolled like thunder against the floorboards. Silas crossed the threshold, fast. No hesitation boots, pounding, until he reached the back room. There. One man held another, pinned fists rising and falling. Blood splattered across the boards. Beneath a splintered table, a girl no older than Maggie wept silent, clutching a broken locket. "Enough," Silas said. The word wasn't loud, but it sliced through the noise clean. The larger man looked up, face twisted, knuckles red. "Ain't your business," he growled. Silas's eyes flicked from the child to the broken man on the floor. He saw it. The terror. The truth. He raised his voice. "Is it true?" he asked the girl. She shook her head, silent tears cutting through grime. "He was protectin' me," she choked. "Papa, he drinks. He hurts, he—" The big man snarled but stepped back. Silas's hand never left the grip of the revolver holstered at his side. "I've got 2 children out there," he said quietly. "Any man raises a hand to them, I'll make sure his bones never see clean ground." The man's face paled. The spell broke. The law arrived late to deputies and the town marshal. Too slow, too thin. Silas didn't wait for them to sort it. He walked back into the light, but as he stepped into the light, Silas knew the real danger wasn't in the saloon, it was still waiting, somewhere beyond the ridge. Eli was there. Maggie pressed against his chest. Both looked up when they saw him. Something in Eli's face shifted. He didn't speak, but when Silas knelt to help them into the wagon, Eli's hand found his for the briefest moment. The ride home passed in silence. The fire in the cabin burned low that night. Maggie curled close to the hearth, breathing soft. Eli sat cross-legged with an old knife, whittling wood into sharp points. Neither spoke much. Silas watched them, watched the way fear clung to the edges of their movements, watched the way Maggie never let go of her brother's sleeve, even in sleep, in the darkest hour. The wind rose. Silas lay awake with one hand on the rifle across his chest, and Eli's voice came soft in the dark. "You're always going to come back." Silas didn't answer. The words caught too deep. Instead, he whispered, so low the wind almost stole it away. "I'll try." They drifted then, into uneasy sleep. But as the moon slipped behind the clouds, somewhere far beyond the ridge, the fires of another camp glowed faint in the night, unseen, but not absent. And the man who wanted them back had not yet begun to ride. At dawn, the sky bled copper over the empty fields, and the hoofbeats came slow at first, then gathering speed like the memory of war. The early light stretched long shadows across the frost-laced ground, painting everything in the bruised colors of a world caught between night and day. The wind moved in restless whispers, stirring the tall grass, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something colder beneath it, something old. Silas Mercer stood motionless near the barn, one gloved hand resting lightly on the barrel of his Henry rifle, the other clenching unconsciously into a fist inside the worn coat. The cold bit through the fabric, but it wasn't the cold that made his breath come tight. He hadn't touched the metal in months, hadn't wanted to remember what it once meant. But this morning, something felt different. The children were awake before first light. Eli Banner, sharp-eyed and drawn tight as wire, hovered near the window, watching every shift of wind, every distant sound. Maggie remained close to the hearth, her small hands clutching the hem of an old shawl. She was humming quietly, something tuneless, broken at the edges. Silas knew this rhythm, knew the way fear crept into the marrow of the young and made them brittle. He had seen it in soldiers, in burned towns, in the faces of men who'd buried too many names to count. And he saw it now. plain as day, in the way Eli's fingers never strayed far from the old hunting knife he'd been given. "We ride today," Silas murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He stood by the door, adjusting the strap of the saddlebag. "Need supplies. Can't put it off." Eli's eyes flashed. "They'll know," he whispered. "If we go to town." "They already know," Silas answered quietly. The trail into Dustmere Crossing was slick with thawing mud, the wagon wheels biting deep into the ruts. The sky overhead held no warmth, just the cold gleam of clouded silver. They passed the twisted bones of an old way station, long abandoned, its sign dangling useless from rusted chain. Somewhere far off. The call of a lone crow echoed across the lowlands. The town itself was little more than a scatter of broken roofs, narrow alleys, and faces too worn to remember joy. Dustmere Crossing had never been a place for kindness. It was a way stop for men on the run, for coin that changed hands without questions. And as Silas brought the wagon to a halt in front of the general store, he felt the eyes gathering slow, suspicious. The clerk behind the counter raised his chin in recognition. He said nothing about the children. The goods were gathered in silence: salt pork, lamp oil, ammunition. Eli kept Maggie close, one hand always resting protectively across her back. They were stepping back into the street when the voice cut across the stillness. "Hey." Silas turned, slow. The figure was tall, lean, dressed in a coat too fine for Dustmere's filth. The badge on his chest gleamed sharp in the morning light. His eyes were cold, his mouth set in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Those children with you?" the man asked, voice smooth as polished glass. "They are," Silas replied, voice steady, though every breath felt tight. The man nodded toward Maggie, who instinctively shrank behind Eli. "Funny thing," the man continued, eyes narrowing. "Rancher down south reported a pair gone missing. Might be these two. Can't say for sure till I ask the right questions." Silas stepped forward. He felt the weight of the rifle at his back, but didn't reach for it. "They're not his," he said calmly. "I paid for them." The badge man raised an eyebrow. "Paid. Like human beings that needed saving." The tension stretched thin as wire. Across the street, a saloon door creaked in the breeze. Somewhere a dog barked, distant and hollow. "Got any proof of that?" the lawman asked. Silas said nothing. He could feel Eli trembling beside him. The boy's knuckles were white where they gripped his sister's hand. The silence might have broken, then might have snapped into bloodshed right there in the street. But fate cracked the air with a scream. It came from behind the saloon, sharp, ragged, desperate. Help, a woman's voice, wild with panic. The lawman's head turned. Silas moved before the man could speak, shoving Maggie into Eli's arms. "Stay," he said. "No matter what." He ran. The saloon's shadow yawned wide. The smell of stale whiskey and old smoke thick on the air. Chairs overturned. Glass crunched under his boots. The sounds of struggle dragged him forward through the haze, past the broken tables, until he found the source. A man. Broad and wild-eyed, held another pinned against the bar's far wall, his fists falling heavy and rhythmically, blood smearing across cracked wood, beneath an upended table. A child, a girl no older than Maggie, sat curled, clutching something that glinted in the half-light. "Enough," Silas said. The word dropped cold into the room. The larger man hesitated, fist half raised. His breath came ragged. His lip curled in a sneer. "Not your concern," the man spat. He touched her. "I saw it. Don't need no law to deal with that." Silas's gaze shifted to the girl, her face pale, her eyes wide. She shook her head, tears already cutting paths through the grime. "He's my uncle," she whispered, voice broken. He wasn't hurting me." The air turned colder. The man's fists tightened. Silas's voice lowered to something near a growl. "I've got 2 children waiting outside," he said, "and if any man ever lays hands on them, I'll bury him deep. You understand me?" The bigger man faltered. Pride flickered in his eyes. But something else took hold. Fear. Perhaps. Or shame. He stepped back. The bloodied figure slumped to the floor, unmoving. The doors swung open. The law arrived late. As always, Deputy Marshal Thorne, flanked by 2 tired-looking men with shotguns. Their faces registered the mess, but no one moved to untangle it further. Silas brushed past without a word. The street was still. The children stood where he'd left them. Maggie's eyes were red from crying. Eli's mouth was set in a grim line. "You left." The boy murmured not accusation, just a soft disbelief. Silas crouched beside them. His breath steamed in the cold air. "I came back," he said quietly. Eli's hand tightened around his sister's. His jaw worked silently. "You always gonna come back?" the boy whispered. The words struck deeper than Silas cared to admit. He nodded once. "Rough. I'll try," he said, voice low. They rode out of town under a sky gone to rust. The wind pulled at their coats, the wagon wheels groaning beneath the weight of supplies and unsaid things. By the time they reached the ridge above the homestead, the sun had dipped behind the hills. The first stars bled through the clouds. That night. The cabin glowed dim with firelight. Maggie fell asleep early, her hand curled around the frayed edge of an old quilt. Eli sat by the hearth, sharpening a stick into a crude spear, his eyes distant but clearer, somehow less wild. Silas cleaned the rifle in slow, deliberate motions, each piece laid out with care, not because he feared the rifle would fail, but because it was the one act of control he could still claim. The wind shifted outside, soft, breathless. The trees whispered against the dark. Hours later, when the fire had burned down to ash, Eli's voice drifted through the quiet. "You ain't like the others," he said softly. Silas looked up but said nothing. The boy's voice thinned to almost nothing. "Don't matter if you say you'll come back. Folks say things, then they don't." Silas's thumb traced the scar along the stock of his rifle. His heart felt heavy with memory. "I know," he murmured. "I know." The cabin slept. The world turned, far beyond the hills. A distant flicker of light marked the camp of riders who had not forgotten. And the man who hunted them, who saw the children as nothing but coin, had not yet made his move. But he would. And Silas Mercer knew the storm had only just begun. The rain came first, thin, cold, and bitter, soaking the earth as Silas Mercer dug shallow trenches with numb hands, knowing full well graves might soon follow. The sky pressed low over the land, a bruised canvas of iron and ash. The wind howled through the hollow trees, bending them into crooked shapes against the gray. Each drop of rain stung cold against his skin, but Silas worked without stopping, the steel of the spade biting into soft earth over and over. The memory of the cradle still untouched in the cabin's corner haunted him more than the ache in his bones. He hadn't built that crib for nothing. He'd built it for a child who never came home. And now, though he could feel the weight of the past pressing hard, he kept digging. Because this time, there were children who might still be saved. Behind him, The small cabin by Cinder Bluff held the warmth of a single low-burning fire. He could hear their voices when the wind shifted soft and small. Maggie's occasional cough, Eli's careful words, always hushed, always watchful. Even the old deputy, Marshal Thorne, moved quiet through the cabin now. His boots softened against the wooden floor like a man who knew that sound could call death faster than a shout. They'd known this day would come. Dustmere Crossing had too many eyes, too many mouths, and the men who'd once claimed the children were not the sort to let go. Silas straightened, breath frosting in the wet air, and scanned the tree line. He could feel the difference in the wind, not just the storm gathering, but something colder, older, the kind of stillness that always came before blood was spilled. When he stepped back inside, Maggie looked up from her place by the hearth. She clutched a tattered rag doll, now one Eli had made from scraps and twine. Her green eyes were dull with fever, her small hands shaking as she held the doll close to her chest. Every loud crack from outside made her flinch, and when Silas passed by, she instinctively reached out, her fingers brushing his coat as if seeking any scrap of reassurance. "You don't have to be afraid," Silas said softly, crouching to feed another stick into the fire. Maggie's voice was no louder than the wind outside. "He'll come," she whispered. "He always does." Silas didn't lie. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He only offered a small nod and reached for the kettle. Eli stood near the window, the old knife he carried resting in his palm. His fingers traced the worn handle as he stared out across the sodden field. "Marshall came back," the boy murmured without looking away. "Said they'll come at night. Said they might set fire." Silas exhaled slowly. "We won't be here long if it comes to that." The boy glanced at him then. Something flickering in his gaze. Doubt. Maybe. Or the beginnings of belief. Later, with the rain still falling and dusk bleeding into full dark. They set the final defenses. Thorne helped without complaint, his face drawn, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening as he hammered the last of the iron nails into the doorframe. Together. They dragged the wagon close to the side of the house to form a makeshift barrier. Stacked barrels and wet hay bales where they could. "Won't stop a bullet," Thorne muttered, wiping mud from his brow. "Buys time," Silas said. They worked until their hands were raw. Every motion was done without speaking now. No need for words, just the endless, heavy rhythm of preparation. In the stillness of that night, inside the narrow cabin lit by flickering lamplight, the children helped in their own ways. Eli sharpened sticks into crude weapons. Maggie sat threading scraps of cloth into something that might have been a pouch. And Ruth, quiet. Distant Ruth moved from corner to corner, her eyes flicking always to the window. Silas noticed. The way she didn't seem to sit still. The way she flinched at every sudden noise. There was something off in her stillness, something brittle beneath her silence. He tucked the thought away. Not now. Not yet. By the time the moon rose pale and thin behind fast-moving clouds, the sound came. Distant hoofbeats. At first. It was barely there. A suggestion more than a sound. But it grew steady. Deliberate until even Maggie stirred from half-sleep. Her small body tensing as her fingers clutched the doll tight. Silas stood. The lamp was doused. The fire burned low. Outside, shadows moved along the far edge of the field, shapes against shapes, men on horseback, some dismounted, some standing still like silhouettes carved from night. Thorne cursed under his breath. "It's them." Silas lifted the Henry rifle, the weight of it familiar and cold. He glanced once at the children. Eli stood like a statue. Ruth's hands twisted in her lap. "You stay here," Silas said quietly. "No one opens that door. Not for anything." Eli nodded once, though his eyes burned with something fierce, something terrified. Silas stepped out into the wet air, boots sinking into cold mud. The rain had eased, but the mist clung low, coiling around every stump and fence post. The men 6, maybe 7, stood beyond the broken fence line. No torches, no shouts. Just the quiet, eerie stillness of men who had come for something they meant to take without negotiation. Then one man stepped forward. His coat was long and black, gleaming with wet. His voice, when it came, was soft and cold. "You got something that don't belong to you," he called. Silas said nothing. "Last chance," the man continued. "You hand him over. No blood. Just business." From the corner of his eye, Silas caught a flicker of movement near the barn. Another shadow, too small, too close. His stomach twisted sharp. "Ruth," he breathed. It happened fast. She stood frozen, her small hands on the barn latch, her face vacant, eyes glassy as if trapped in some unseen memory, before he could call out again. The latch fell. A figure small, slight unlatched the barn gate. Just enough. Just a sliver. Silas didn't think. He fired once high. Not to hit, to signal. Chaos exploded. The riders charged. Gunfire cracked. Thorne's shotgun roared. The air filled with the screams of horses and the spit of mud as bullets tore into wood. Silas moved without thought, rolling behind the wagon. Returning fire. His heart pounded like thunder. Breath ragged as he ducked and fired again. A man fell screaming into the mud. Another dropped, motionless. Thorne cursed as he reloaded. Bastards brought morn, I thought. A shadow lunged from the side. Silas swung the rifle hard, striking the figure across the jaw. The man went down. Through it all, Ruth stood near the gate, motionless, hands slack. Eli hesitated just for a heartbeat, his small frame frozen in terror. But then Maggie's whimper behind him jolted something loose, with trembling legs and breath hitching in his chest. He stumbled into the open, barely able to breathe, barely able to think, but somehow his hands still found Ruth's arm, pulling her back. "What are you doing?" Eli shouted, dragging her toward the door. Her face was blank, eyes empty, as if she didn't fully understand what she'd done. Silas fired again last round, and then the riders broke. The surviving men pulled back, retreating into the fog, leaving their dead in the churned field behind them. The quiet came sharp and sudden. For a long moment, no one moved. Silas stood, rifle shaking in his grip. His breath burned in his throat. Eli half-dragged Ruth through the cabin door, slamming it behind them. The wind howled. Maggie sobbed quietly, clinging to the doll as if it were her only anchor. And Silas knew, without needing to speak it aloud, that this had not been the real attack. It had only just begun. From the porch, with rain slicking the brim of his hat, he caught the glint of something deeper in the dark beyond the ridge. More campfires, more riders, and the certainty settled in his bones like stone. The worst was still coming. They would not survive the next night unless something changed. They would not survive unless he changed. And somewhere far beyond the reach of the firelight, the man who hunted them, Harlan Voss, was already moving. The first sign of direct betrayal, a barn door left unlocked, a strange symbol drawn in ash. Silas suspects but cannot act yet. From the porch, Silas sees the first flickers of campfires in the far trees, faint red dots in the darkness. The siege has begun. At dawn. The world was still unnervingly so, as if the land itself held its breath, waiting for the first shot to shatter everything. The sky above Cinder Bluff hung low, bruised and heavy, the kind of gray that blurred the line between night and day. Mist coiled through the trees, clinging to the ground like smoke, softening the jagged outlines of the cabin, the barn, the makeshift barricades they had built through the cold, wet hours of the night. The fires in the distance had burned low, but the men who lit them were still out there waiting. Silas Mercer moved like a man in a half-forgotten dream. The leather of his gloves was slick from rain and sweat, the barrel of his rifle cold against his palm. He scanned the tree line again and again, but the dark shapes beyond the rise stayed just the shadows. Not yet men, not yet monsters. But soon, in the cabin, Eli Banner was awake before the others, standing by the window with the knife Silas had given him held tight in one hand. His jaw was set in something almost too old for his face, but behind his wide, sleepless eyes was the unmistakable flicker of a child's fear. His fingers twitched now and then, not from cold, but from the tremble of someone trying very hard not to cry. Maggie lay curled near the hearth, her breath thin and wheezing, her doll clutched to her chest with desperate fingers. Ruth silent. Distant, Ruth sat apart from them. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her fingers trembling slightly. No one spoke it aloud. But the question hung in the air, why had she opened the gate? Silas's mind turned over the memory, her dazed expression, the way she hadn't seemed to recognize her own hands. There were stories of men like Voss using more than coin, using fear. Whispered threats, the breaking of fragile minds, whatever hold he had on her. It wasn't gone yet. It wasn't treachery, he thought grimly. It was fear, or worse, the kind of hold that men like Voss knew too well how to twist. She had not spoken since the night before, since the barn door had swung open, since her small, traitorous hands had reached for the latch. Silas had said nothing to her yet, hadn't needed to. The air between them was thick enough with what hadn't been said. Thorne leaned against the cabin wall, sharpening a blade by lantern light. His eyes flicked to Silas now and again, but the two men barely spoke. There was no need. Some things didn't require words, not when the end was close enough to taste. The morning crawled. The children ate in near silence dry biscuits, cold beans. Every breath felt like a borrowed one. And then the hoofbeats came. The sound rippled through the wet air, soft at first, then rising steady. Silas stepped onto the porch, rifle raised. Thorne was at his side in seconds, his shotgun already loaded, the barrel steady. They came from the north, this time, figures on horseback, coats dark, faces half-shadowed beneath wide brims. The first row dismounted, weapons slung, moving slow, like they knew they had time, like they believed the game was already won. Silas's breath came slow, measured. He could feel the weight of memory pressing down another line of men, another battlefield, another time when he'd stood like this, knowing some would not live to see the next sunrise. The man at the front stepped forward. His coat was fine, black wool. His face was lean, sharp, the kind of face made for cold rooms and colder decisions. His voice, when it came, was soft as winter ash. "You've made this harder than it needed to be," the man said. "But we're here now. No more games." Silas said nothing. "Last chance," the man went on. "Send the girl out. Send the boy too, if you like. They're marked. They're property. You know how this works." I know exactly how this works, Silas said. His voice was low, even. The man smiled without warmth. Then you understand. I understand, Silas murmured, lifting the rifle, that you don't get to walk away. The shot cracked through the stillness like a whip. Chaos followed. The first man dropped hard, his coat twisting as he hit the mud. The riders scattered, gunfire erupting in sharp bursts. Thorn fired, the roar of the shotgun shaking the porch. The barricades buckled as horses screamed, hooves churning the wet earth into black mire. Silas dropped to one knee, firing again. Another man fell. From the corner of his eye, he caught movement. Eli, standing in the doorway, the knife still in his hand, too brave for his own good, too close to danger. Inside, Silas bellowed, voice rough as gravel. Eli ducked back, Maggie's cry audible over the thunder of gunfire. The men came fast closer now. One vaulted the broken fence, pistol raised. Silas spun, rifle butt slamming into the attacker's jaw. Bone crunched. The man crumpled. The rain poured harder. Smoke blurred the edges of sight. Silas barely registered the pain in his shoulder, something sharp, hot. He pressed forward, teeth clenched, breath coming hard. And then, through the haze, he saw her. Ruth. The girl stood near the gate, hands slack at her sides, her face blank, unmoving. She didn't flinch when one of the men staggered past her, didn't run, didn't scream. Eli reached her first, snatched her arm, pulling her back toward the cabin, his voice a sharp cry of fury and fear. Silas caught only fragments. Something about her eyes, something about not letting go. The fight broke, then fractured into ragged chaos. One man, his coat torn, his mouth bloodied, turned and ran. Another followed, limping. The rest fell back, dragging their wounded, leaving the bodies of two men sprawled in the mud. Silas stood, rifle trembling in his hands, his breath sawed harsh through his teeth. The quiet returned too fast, too sudden. The barn roof was shattered, the last of the stored grain ruined by stray bullets. Silas's breath caught not just from the fight, but from the knowledge that survival had just become harder. Inside. The children huddled. Maggie wept. Ruth stared, her eyes still glassy, as if she hadn't come back from wherever she'd gone. Thorne reloaded in silence. Blood spattered across his sleeve. Silas stepped into the cabin. The smell of gunpowder clung to him. His knees ached. His heart pounded. He met Eli's eyes, saw the terror there, the confusion, the anger. "You did good," Silas rasped. His voice barely held steady. "You kept her safe." But Eli didn't answer. His hands shook too badly to hold the knife now. The rain drummed harder on the roof. Silas turned toward Ruth. The girl stood in the corner, motionless, her face pale. She blinked slowly, as though seeing the room for the first time. "I didn't mean," she whispered, voice thin as paper. Silas said nothing. Not yet. Not with the children still watching. Not with the night not yet over. Hours passed. The dead were dragged to the far side of the ridge. The horses were gathered. The fires beyond the trees still burned small, but steady. Night fell again, but none of them slept. Silas sat with his back to the door, rifle across his lap, the lantern guttering low. And in the dark, with the rain still falling, he let his hand drift to the weight in his pocket, the old medal, cold against his fingers. He hadn't prayed in years. He didn't start now. But he did whisper one thing into the shadows. Not this time. And far off, beyond the line of sight, beyond the veil of rain, The real threat moved unseen. A hand unseen. Waiting. Watching. The worst of it still ahead. They came from the north this time, figures on horseback. Coats dark. Faces half-shadowed beneath wide brims. The first row dismounted. Weapons slung. Moving slow. Like they knew they had time. Like they believed the game was already won. The storm had passed, but the wind still smelled of ash, and in the silent fields. The dead lay quiet while the living gathered what remained. Morning broke in thin. Gray ribbons over the battered homestead. Smoke drifted in lazy spirals from the half-scorched barn. The earth around it torn and soaked with mud. With blood. The bodies had been dragged off during the first blue hours before dawn, buried shallow beyond the ridge where the crows would not reach them easily. The fires of the enemy camps had gone dark, but the air still carried their memory something cold, something unfinished. Silas Mercer moved stiffly across the yard, his coat still wet from the endless rain, the weight of exhaustion riding heavy in his bones. His hands were raw from work splitting wood, reinforcing what little remained of the cabin's defenses, tending to the broken shutters that the night's gunfire had splintered. But the work was not just survival. It was ritual. It was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. Inside, the children slept. Maggie, at last, had surrendered to sheer exhaustion, her tiny hands curled around the threadbare doll like it was a lifeline. Eli dozed in the corner near the hearth, the old knife still clutched in his fingers. Even Ruth, pale and silent, lay folded in on herself near the door, her face slack in uneasy dreams. The weight of the siege had pressed them all down into something thinner, quieter, something barely breathing. Thorne stood near the porch rail, rubbing a hand across his unshaven jaw. His eyes flicked from the tree line to the road to the empty sky beyond. When Silas met his gaze, the deputy just shook his head once. "Too quiet," Thorne muttered. Silas nodded. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "They're not done." The cabin itself bore the scars of the night bullet holes patched with wet cloth. Broken glass swept into careful piles near the door. The land beyond, though, was what held the tension. The children had survived the first assault. The men who wanted them had not claimed them. But Silas knew men like Harlan Voss, knew the kind of rot that ran deeper than one failed raid. He wasn't just fighting a gang, he was fighting something older, a sickness of the land itself, a world where people could be bought, broken, discarded, and the worst of it was still coming. By midday, they buried the last of the dead. It was Thorne who carried the bodies. Silas dug the graves. The cold earth gave up its weight in wet clumps, and when it was done, they marked the mounds with nothing but stones, no names, no words, just the sound of wind moving through the prairie grass. "Won't be the last," Thorne said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. Silas set the spade down. "No." The children gathered near the cabin when they returned. Maggie's fever had broken, but her eyes were still glassy with the kind of fear that doesn't lift easy. Eli stood with her, his hand never straying far from her shoulder. Ruth, quiet as ever, sat apart, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes far away. It was Maggie who broke the stillness first. Her voice was soft, barely above the wind. "Are they gone?" she whispered. Silas crouched before her, the ache in his knees sharp. He met her gaze so small, so fragile. For now. He murmured, "But not forever." Maggie's lower lip quivered. "I don't want to go back in a cage." "You won't," Silas said. The words were soft, but they rang like iron. By late afternoon, they gathered in the cabin to talk of what came next. "We can't stay," Thorne said flatly. "Not if Voss is still breathing. He'll send more. Or worse." Silas didn't look up from the rifle he was cleaning. "I know. Could ride south. Take the children to Silver Bluff. Folks there? They might help." Silas's hands stilled, or they might sell him back. Thorne exhaled sharply, glancing toward the children. "Ain't much law left in places like this," he admitted. The weight of that truth sat heavy between them. It was Eli who spoke next, his voice small, but clear. "We ain't runnin'?" The boy's eyes met Silas's, fierce despite the tremor in his jaw. "You're not," Silas said quietly. "But I am." The words turned every head. Even Ruth blinked, her pale gaze lifting. Silas set the rifle aside. "I'll ride out. Find the man behind this. End it. I'm not letting this come to the door again." Maggie's breath caught. Eli's hands clenched. "You said you'd stay," the boy whispered. His voice cracked on the last word. Silas swallowed. The weight of memory pressed close the old house, the empty crib, the broken grave. "I'm not leaving," he murmured. "I'm making sure you've got something to stay for." The decision hung there in the low light. There was no argument, only the slow, inevitable understanding. That night. The wind rose again. The trees groaned under its weight. The cabin flickered with candlelight, and Maggie drifted into uneasy sleep with her head resting on Eli's arm. Thorne kept watch near the door. Ruth sat by the hearth, unmoving, her face hidden beneath strands of tangled hair. Silas stood near the window, his coat already slung across his shoulders, the rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He didn't bother packing much, just bullets, just rope, just the iron metal stitched into the coat pocket. Cold and silent. The moon rose high, thin, and sharp as a blade. When Eli stirred, half waking, Silas crossed the room and pulled the worn blanket higher over Maggie's small shoulders. The boy's eyes blinked open heavy, confused. "You'll come back," Eli murmured. Silas's throat worked hard. He nodded once. "I'll try," he said softly. The boy didn't speak again. Silas stepped out into the cold. The wind caught the hem of his coat. The mare waited near the fence line, breath steaming in the silver air. He mounted without sound, guiding the horse away from the faint glow of the cabin, down toward the shadowed line of the ridge. He kept his eyes forward, the cabin's glow fading behind him. By the time Silas reached the ridge, the night was already broken by the glow of distant fire. Voss waited alone, leaning against the black mare. A thin smile carved across his face. "Thought you'd come," Voss murmured. The wind caught his coat, the gleam of a silver knife catching the moonlight. They didn't speak much. Words had run out. The gunshot echoed sharp. One shot. Clean. Voss fell without ceremony, his body hitting the cold earth like a stone. The sickness of him, the cruelty, ended in silence. Silas stood over the still form, breath ragged. It was done. Far beyond, across the unseen miles, the heart of the sickness still waited. And by the time dawn came again, Silas Mercer would be on its doorstep. But danger, like old ghosts, was never truly gone. Out there where the wind still moves through the grass like whispered memories, where the sun dips low over land that never quite forgets the weight of old footsteps. The story lingers not in the words spoken, but in the quiet that followed, in the breath of stillness that settled after the last shot was fired and the last name was spoken aloud. You can still hear it if you listen close, the creak of weathered wood, the rustle of prairie flowers blooming wild along a fence line long since broken, the soft whicker of horses grazing under a sky vast enough to swallow sorrow and hope in the same breath. Some stories don't end in thunder, but in the small, steadfast choices made when no one else is watching. Choices carved from something deeper than pride or vengeance, choices born of simple, stubborn decency. There was no grand parade for Silas Mercer. No headlines printed on brittle sheets of newsprint, no statues raised beneath the brittle sun. But there are other kinds of monuments, the kind built in memory, in the hands of children who learn to laugh again, in the ragged edge of a torn shawl mended by careful stitches, in the way a house once silent came to hold music again, even if only in the soft hum of a girl's voice beside the hearth. Out here, folks say the wind carries stories like that for those willing to listen the way the grass bows before it, the way the old trees lean into it, as though the land itself remembers. They say that sometimes justice comes too late to wear a badge or wield a gavel, but it comes just the same, quiet as breath, soft as dust settling over a worn saddle. And they say that though some men vanish into the empty miles, their kindness leaves footprints deeper than any boot could press into the clay, footprints that shape the hearts of those left behind. The cabin still stands on the edge of nowhere, its timbers soaked with old storms and older silences, but inside, the fire burns small, steady, a beacon not for crowds, but for the few who need it most. The wildflowers grow thicker each spring along the creek bed, their colors defiant against the pale dust. And sometimes, on nights when the moon rides high and silver, the sound of children's laughter drifts across the ridge, mingling with the wind. There are those who pass by who don't know the names or the history, but they feel it's something left behind, something that refuses to die. And in that, perhaps, there is a kind of peace, because honor, even buried beneath sorrow and time, is never truly gone, because justice, however belated, still holds weight enough to tip the scales, because sometimes the forgotten woman, the one who once waited, the one whose name never made it into books, becomes the reason a kindness survives, becomes the quiet savior of futures yet unwritten. And sometimes the truth doesn't need the world to believe it. Sometimes it only needs one person willing to carry it through the dust, to hold it up against the dark. These are the truths the land remembers. These are the names it keeps, and as the wind shifts westward, carrying with it the breath of distant thunder, you might feel something stir a call, not of urgency, but of remembrance, of the steady pulse of stories too gentle to shout, but too stubborn to fade. So if you hear this, and you still believe in the weight of honor, in the whisper of redemption, in the soft unfurling of forgiveness, let it be known not in loud voices, but in quiet ones, in the tapping of fingers, in the simple act of saying, "I still believe." If you wish to carry this story further, to keep the lantern burning against the dark, you are invited softly, gently to press one or to follow the echoes of Westwind Whispers, where the next story waits patient as a desert dawn. Out here, the wind still remembers. And perhaps, somewhere in the heart of the listener, the story does too.